Dear participants, welcome. Today is 23rd of May, 2024, day 818 of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. I'm Radim Žák, head of the Prague Process Secretariat and head of Eastern Europe and Central Asia region at the International Center for Migration Policy Development. It is my honor to welcome you to the Prague Process webinar. Looking at the number of registered participants, the audience today should be more than 220 attendees. Today, we gather to discuss the issue of continuing grave concern. The one which has been articulated with deep alarm at the Fourth Prague Process Ministerial Conference in 2022, namely the forced migration from Ukraine amidst ongoing Russia's military aggression. Assistance to Ukraine has become central for ICMPD. In our work, we have continued to focus on the dialogue within the Prague process, on the integrated border management in Ukraine in cooperation with the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, the State Customs Service, and the Parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. Assistance has been provided to the State Migration Service and the Consular Service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the pre-consular support, including via established Ukrainian consultation centers in Prague, Berlin, and Gdansk, as well as through work directly with the citizens of Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora abroad. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not only breached international law and inflicted unspeakable suffering of millions of innocent people, but has also triggered one of the most significant forced migrations in recent history. At present, some 10 million Ukrainians remain displaced within and outside Ukraine's international borders. This conflict and the resulting displacement are a human tragedy with a profound geopolitical impact. The observed security, political, economic, and social implications are not just regional, but of a global scope. The situation of displacement is complex and fluid, with outcomes that vary widely depending on several potential scenarios of warfare. Each scenario carries its own set of challenges and consequences, first and foremost for Ukraine and its people, but also for the entire global community. Our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Franck Düvell, will delve today into several scenarios of war and the corresponding forced displacement from Ukraine, which he laid out in the new Prague Process Policy brief, the third of this kind on this topic. He will explain the methodology used to construct these scenarios and outline the main considerations critical for the analysis. Dr. Düvell has courageously posed a critical question about the potential scale of displacement from Ukraine should the situation further deteriorate and not resolve in Ukrainians' favor. While this question is undoubtedly challenging, it is essential. It serves as a critical reminder of the stakes involved and underscores the vital importance of sustained support from Ukrainian allies. Dr. Franck Düvell is a senior researcher at Osnabrück University, Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies since 2020. Previously, he was head of the Migration Department at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. And from 2013 to 2018, he was associate professor and senior researcher at the Center on Migration Policy and Society at the University of Oxford. Dr. Düvell has over 25 years of experience in conducting and leading research, analysis, and policy advice. He is an expert on international migration, in particular irregular, transit and forced migration, migration governance, and international relations in the field of migration. His studies specifically focus on the countries on the periphery and in the wider neighborhood of the European Union. Dr. Düvell also worked for the International Center for Migration Policy Development, for GIZ, SEO Amsterdam Economics, Nicholas Whitson Foundation, University of Exeter and University of Bremen, and did consultancies for International Organization for Migration, OSCE, and provided evidence to the EU Council, Council of Europe, British Parliament, Turkish Directorate General for Migration Management, and many others. He holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Bremen, conducted more than 25 research projects, and had published 10 books and over 60 research articles in internationally renowned journals. In cooperation with the Prague Process and its Migration Observatory, Dr. Düvell published 3 policy briefs on Ukraine. The first one already in June 2022, the second in January 2024, which is followed by the one published in May 2024 and presented today. He also participated in 2 Prague Process online discussions on Ukraine in April 2022 and May 2023, as well as an ICMPD IGC workshop on temporary protection in February 2023. The title of the policy brief and of today's presentation is Scenarios of War and Forced Migration from Ukraine. How many more Ukrainians could flee if Russia wins? We are aware that together with the author, we have formulated a strong title. It is chosen based on the worst-case hypothetical scenario outlined in the policy brief. The scenario that needs to be prevented jointly in close cooperation and with strong support to Ukraine by its partners in the fight of Ukraine for freedom, democracy, and territorial integrity. Now, just a few weeks before the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Berlin on 11th and 12th of June, and before the Peace Conference in Switzerland on 15th and 16th of June, we find this message very timely. It is crucial to understand that scenarios that you will hear today should not be viewed as prescriptive, but rather as critical insights that can guide policymakers in making informed decisions that may significantly influence the trajectory of the conflict and the ongoing severe displacement crisis. Let us all commit to a discourse that it is not only informed, but also empathetic. We are, after all, discussing the fate and future of millions of human beings, each with the right to safety, dignity, and hope. With this, I turn to Dr. Düvell. Franck, please, the floor is yours.
Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with here today, and thank you very much, Radim, for framing so nicely the purpose of the presentation of the policy brief today. Before I'm beginning with my actual presentation, I would say a few more words about my own background. I have actually been researching matters to do with Ukrainian migration since 2006. First, I worked on transit migration and border security, then immigration to Ukraine, like of refugees, Afghans and Chechens, for example. Later, I studied migration aspirations of Ukrainians who were hoping to be able to migrate abroad. It was an EU-funded project. Subsequently, I also had a project actually on irregular migrants from Ukraine in the UK. And over time, I traveled most of the country except Donbass, I must say. One of the unforgettable experiences was when the Ukrainian Border Guard Service took me on patrols on the eastern border in the Sumy region, but also in the western border in the area of Uzhgorod, to demonstrate what border security means, how that's been managed in Ukraine. Very fascinating at that time. I did consultancies in the earlier years with the Studio Shipping Process, later with the EAP panel on migration. I also actually have family in Ukraine, my in-laws. I have lots of colleagues and some friends, some still in Kharkiv. And obviously the news I receive on a daily basis are extremely worrying and scary. In February 2022, I was actually in Ukraine at Ukrainian Catholic University on the day when the war started. I teach there quite frequently. To get back home, I had to join the track of Ukrainian refugees on day 1 of the war. another experience I will never forget. And ever since, most of my work revolves around the issue of displacement within and from Ukraine, though I had rather different plans. And this is actually my fourth scenario. The first one I did already in November 21. I considered the scope of forced migration in case Russia attacks Ukraine. The purpose was to inform, to alarm the public, hoping that that would then trigger some appropriate responses. I did this to provide governments with better information, how to best respond to the threat, how to prepare for the worst case. I concluded then that up to 10 million Ukrainians would be displaced. We now see that that was probably rather conservative, even though the response I got in November 2021 was that it all sounds more like number crunching fantasy of some mad scientist. And I would have wished to be wrong at that point, and I wish to be wrong this time, obviously. Now I'm going to share my screen. The policy brief is actually rather data heavy and possibly challenging to digest, and therefore today I'm aiming to put matters in simpler terms and concentrate on some key aspects. So the question I'm raising is a typical academic question. How many more Ukrainians could flee if Russia wins the war? This is a thought experiment. It's a hypothetical question. Doesn't mean that I would assume this could happen, but it helps to develop responses and develop solutions. I will talk you through the presentation, first some introduction, then I will briefly sketch the current situation. I will talk at length about methodology. Then I take a look at the patterns of the 2022 displacement. I look at the determinants of displacement and then come to my findings, the scenarios before concluding the seminar. So in spring 2022, and you know all of it, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, targeting the northern, eastern, and southern provinces, including most of the largest cities and the capital, Kiev. We saw the fierce fighting on the outskirts of Kiev. By summer 2022, the Ukrainian army halted and partially repelled, luckily, the invasion, notably in the northeast. Then there was the counteroffensive in autumn 2022, which liberated further territory in Kharkiv and Kherson. Wonderful success. The Ukrainian forces also reclaimed control of the western parts of the Black Sea. I think that's not often and widely recognized. However, unfortunately, the counteroffensive in summer last year in Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk largely failed, I'm afraid. So that Russia still occupies about 70%, I think it is, of the total territory of Ukraine. This is as much as some other European countries like Albania, I believe. From winter 2023-24, Russia unfortunately gained the upper hand and is slowly expanding, very slowly, the occupied territory in the east, though at the expense of very high loss of personnel and equipment. Meanwhile, unfortunately, Western support has been waning, notably in the US, and the Ukrainian army lacked ammunition and soldiers. Matters have improved in recent weeks, so that's good news. The current situation in terms of migration is that by October 2022, so in the first year of the war, 4.6 million people from Ukraine sought protection in the EU, up to 4 million, but that was a false claim, initially moved to Russia. and around 6.5 million were displaced internally. So massive numbers. Since autumn, winter 2022, the migration situation has been fairly stable, also prompting significant return of IDPs and refugees. I think 3 million IDPs and about 1 million international refugees returned home. Good news. End of 2023, there were still about 3.9 to 4 million displaced persons in the EU. I'm a little skeptical about the higher number because this is the number of people who are registered in the EU. It does not necessarily mean that all of them are still in the EU because people commute, they go back temporarily. And there are about 700,000 people in the US, Canada, and Turkey, but also I think it is about 30,000 people in Turkey. Only around 1 million colleagues suggest are still in Russia due to the war, because we have seen larger numbers of people being either deported or fleeing to Russia, but many have also left Russia again to get to the EU or to travel through the EU to get back to government-controlled parts of Ukraine. We still have 3.7 to 4.8 million IDPs within Ukraine, so there are different numbers and statistics here. So in early 2024, this year, a total of 9.6 to 10.8 million remain displaced internally or internationally. This is a huge number. It's also a huge drama for the individuals. Now to the methodology. First, I have developed 4 scenarios of the possible outcome of the war, and this is based on a survey of a whole range of documents and assessments by various organizations. Second, I identify key migration patterns of displacement due to the 2022 invasion. So how did people respond to the invasion, to the bombing and fighting, to the threat? Third, the results serve as a precedent, and I apply these patterns to the scenarios of war. And fourth, the model that I developed is fed with additional data from recent surveys and reports. We need to acknowledge that Ukrainian population statistics are flawed because the last census in Ukraine was only in 2021. So ever since, we mostly work with estimates. Then there are substantial levels of internal and international forced migration. Not all is very well recorded and reported, so this is further distorting population data. And therefore, data on the whereabouts of people within Ukraine come with a caveat. We can't be really certain. And because of that, baseline population statistics predominantly reflect the estimated pre-war situation. So if we look at the population per oblast or per city, then these are mostly pre-war data, and this is estimated data very often. Therefore, from most of the data, one needs to deduct the population that has already left Ukraine because of the war. So 6 million people, 15%, we deduct from the total. Then the data of Ukrainians who fled or were deported to Russia is unreliable and scarce. We don't have any reliable data from Russia. And also data on Russia, it's all estimated. There is no breakdown by the oblast of origin, of gender or age. So we don't really know the characteristics of the people who went to Russia. And then we also need to take into account that IDPs from Russia-occupied provinces and the war zone who moved to government-controlled eastern provinces partly offset the people who already left. So some part of the population left, IDPs moved to the same city. We could see this in Kharkiv, which hosts about 200,000-300,000 IDPs. So that offsets the loss of population by 60-80%. Also, there could be different responses to Russian occupation by partly more Russia-leaning communities, though I can't calculate this statistically. This is an unanswered question or concern. Next, we need to take into account that the characteristics of the population that had already left differ from those who are still in Ukraine. So those who are left, we can see this from the European statistics, are rather younger, age 18 to 44. I say 18 because I assume that the children do not have agency but move with their mothers or family. They are mostly female and they are rather well educated, demonstrating that this group, has a higher propensity to migrate. Those who stayed are the older, age 45 to 95, male, less educated, demonstrating a lower propensity to migrate than the younger people. Therefore, separate calculations for migration propensity are required for these two major age groups, 40 up to 44 and older than 44. So consequently, I add a 25% adjustment factor to any generic prospective migration estimates for the entire population. We also need to recognize that because of the war and displacement, the gender and family composition of the population has changed due to the disproportionately high level of migration of women with their children. And patterns of female migration cannot be applied to the men left behind. And this, I believe, is for three reasons. The propensity of men to flee Ukraine in case of Russian control might be even higher than the propensity of women, because first, they would seek to join their families, their wives and children who are already abroad. Second, they would need to escape Russian repression even more, and this specifically applies to those who are in the army, soldiers, as well as those who are in government jobs and public administration and similar. But also, in the worst case, if Russia advances, martial law might become ineffective, so that men would leave in larger numbers. Finally, in all I'm saying, I only consider the population in the government-controlled territories. Now, the patterns of displacement so far. Initially, in 2022, 13.8 million Ukrainians were displaced. This is one of the largest and fastest case of displacement since the Second World War, 36% of the total population. By 2024, still over 9.5 million people are still displaced. I said this, 6 million internationally, 3.5 million internally, and almost 2 million are IDPs in the provinces bordering Russia-occupied territories, so bordering the fighting zones. There are very, very roughly over 800,000 IDPs from Luhansk, over 800,000 IDPs from Donetsk, about 450,000, 440, I say here, from Zaporizhia, and 440,000 IDPs from Kherson. And the refugees in the EU from these four provinces are 58,000 from Luhansk, 340,000 from Donetsk, 134,000 from Zaporizhia, and 163,000 from Kherson. Plus 40% more who went to the US, Canada, UK, Turkey, but also Russia. But here Russia, I said, we don't have any good data. So in total, from Donetsk, there are already almost 1.3 million displaced persons, 896,000 in Luhansk, over 600,000 in Zaporizhia, and over 600 or around 670,000 from Kherson. Plus, about 670,000 from Donetsk and Luhansk who moved to Russia already in 2014. So these people have already left the Russia-occupied territory. The result is the following picture. This shows the percentage of IDPs from Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And this is very important because it's the first building block of my scenario. What would happen in case things get much, much worse. So this I apply then to the provinces threatened to be occupied, as well as entire Ukraine, worst case scenario, corrected by all the factors I've mentioned in the methodology section. Hence, different behavior of different age groups, different behaviors of the two genders, notably different behavior of men in the armed forces. This comes with a caveat because I take Donetsk as an exception because only 33% are displaced. I rather take Lugansk and Kherson as the average. Almost 50 to almost 70% of the population is displaced. And there are uncertainties about the relatively low number, 37% displaced from Zaporizhia, because this only applies to the less populated occupied part of the south, whereas the north of the oblast with the capital Zaporizhia with Kryvyi, which is much more densely populated, not yet affected. And therefore, I suggest that the level of displacement in case more territory comes under Russian control is rather 50 to 75% of the remaining population. And this is important because it demonstrates that most likely only a minority of Ukrainians will accept life under Russian boots. People don't want to come under Russian boots. They fight like hell. If things would go wrong, then people would rather leave than accept a Russian ruling. This is clearly demonstrated, I believe, by the pattern so far. So what are the determinants of displacement? The remaining population government control territory is about 31, some say 33 million. The proportion who fled occupied territory is 35% if we look at Donetsk, or rather 55 to 75%. The propensity to migrate of the up to 44 years old, I repeat, is very high. So of the over 10 million, almost 4 to 8 million would flee. Propensity of the other age group, older than 45, is lower. So we have a little less than 9 million people in this age group, and 1.5 to over 3 million would potentially flee. The propensity of the remaining men in the country, over 9 million, is higher, also because 1 million of them are somehow in the armed forces or connected to the armed forces. Now to the scenarios. The first one, this is what one would hope for, is that Russia would be stopped, there is no new displacement, and people would be able to return. The second, this is what we see at the moment, I believe. Russia only makes relatively small gains so that few more Ukrainians will be displaced, mostly internally, but also because of the insecurity, fewer people would return. In a worst case, Russia could occupy the remainder of Donetsk Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, potentially even Kiev, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. This is Russia's war aim. This is not what we all hope would happen. That would affect a population of over 16 million people. 6.5 to almost 12 million people would flee, including those who are already IDPs in these oblasts. Most of the people would move to Western Europe. And now I break it down. If only Kiev would be affected, if only Kharkiv would be affected, if only Dnipro would be affected, and so on. If all of Ukraine would be occupied because people don't want to come under Russian boots, in the lowest case, over 9 million people would flee the country, medium 13 million, maximum, according to what I've explained, almost 20 million people would flee, and 85% would flee to the West, only 15% to Russia. To continue, if the current migration pattern persists, roughly, I've said 15% could move to Russia, 85% could move westward, so that would be 7 to 16 million people. So far, 20% went to Poland, that would make 1.5 to almost 3.5 million. Another 20% went to Germany, another 1.5 to 3 million. 8 to 10% went to the Czech Republic, so that's 700,000 to 1.4 million. So far, 11% went to the US and Canada, so that could be 850,000 to almost 1.5 million, and the rest would go to other EU member states. Obviously, this is truly shocking, as were my scenarios in 2021. However, the numbers per host country will likely be lower in such a worst-case scenario because refugees will be dispersed more evenly due to some saturation effect, and possibly also because of political management of forced migration. So I would argue, and this is the conclusion, that the West needs to understand that Ukrainians will not accept coming under Russian control or even occupation, but fight, or in the worst case, will rather leave their home and country. But if Russia would make further significant advances or would even bring all of Ukraine under its control, the EU would face another massive wave of displacement and millions of refugees. And this would be unprecedented and only comparable with displacement after World War II. We then had 12.5 million displaced persons in Western Europe, 22.5 million across all of Europe, along with 12 million displaced Germans. The current labor shortages within the EU, we have 6 million vacancies. We are facing a population decline of over 7 million people over the coming, I think it's 7 or 10 years, imply that in mere numerical terms, labor market integration might not even be the key challenges. The challenges are rather housing, administration, schools, kindergarten, and social matters. And a key question, how could states and societies prevent, of course, or if the worst case happen, prepare for this? And I shall stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Frank. Here at this point, I'd like to encourage participants to ask their questions using the chat. I will try to facilitate the questions as they come. In case the questions are asked in Russian language, my colleagues will assist with translating into English. And before I start, I would like to add that you should do all the best all possible to prevent the scenarios, dark scenarios that you have outlined, Franck. And I think there are a number of variables and aspects that affect also the approaches. I could mention the strengthened support from the EU side, including the EU-Ukraine facility, the US military support, the bilateral support that Ukraine is receiving. There are many other ideas that come to my head listening to your presentation, which have not been included. That could be the recent law on mobilization in effect in Ukraine as of 18th of May. It could be also, when it comes to displacement, the approaches that relate to policy decisions and the temporary protection directive continuation or alternatives to it. There's a lot to address in our maybe also future policy briefs. I also assume there might be questions formulated in that direction. What I noted during your presentation is the size that you mentioned, that we refer to Ukraine being the biggest country in Europe between the Russian part of the Russian European part and between France. So the size also matters when we speak of oblasts or provinces. We basically mean the area and population of some smaller countries one could think of. You mentioned Donetsk Oblast being comparable to a certain extent to Albania, for example. Or if we speak about the size, those 4 oblasts illegally declared by Russia as part of the Russian Federation, those equal in area and population to the size of, for example, Hungary or Portugal, roughly speaking. So I think this is something that one should keep in mind when speaking of Ukraine and the impact of the Russian aggression. And I'm looking at the chat now, but before we collect first questions from my side, first one would be for considering the limited capacity of government-controlled areas in Ukraine to accommodate more IDPs, how should resources be prioritized to address the needs of those most at risk of displacement? Franck, please.
That's a difficult question. The key priority is to prevent the worst case from happening, to prevent that further territory of Ukraine comes under Russian occupation or control, to prevent that more parts of Ukraine, and I think of the critical infrastructure, will be destroyed, so that parts of the country would become unlivable. And it looks very much like this is one of the Russian aims of the war. Obviously, immediately one needs to care and cater for those who are displaced. First couple of days, so evacuation, emergency housing, emergency services. But this is only for the first couple of weeks. So in order to allow people to remain within the country beyond the security situation, and this is what the Ukrainian government does all the time, is to care for the IDPs within the borders of territory, find accommodation. And I can't really comment on the capacity of Ukraine to accommodate even more IDPs. We now have such huge numbers, which is a major task, and accommodating another several million IDPs. This is not my expertise, and the Ukrainian participants in this seminar would know much better than I. If the worst comes to the worst, then different than in 2022, governments in the EU member states would need to be better prepared to receive any significant increase of displaced persons from Ukraine. That starts at the border. Maybe we could avoid people queuing with family, with children, with the elderly, with the handicapped, to wait at the border in their cars for 2-3 days. There was a period when that was the case, and that caused quite some hardship. On the other side, dispersal was rather improvised, and governments, city municipalities, and I think of Krakow, Wrocław, Berlin, Frankfurt, Oder, were not well prepared. Without the help of civil society, the refugee reception management would have collapsed within days and weeks, certainly in Germany. So having in the drawer some blueprint for a worst case scenario of a massive influx of refugees, how to arrange emergency accommodation, how to arrange emergency registration faster than in 2022 would be something, I would recommend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm looking at the chat and the questions asked. I will try to summarize them. I see that to some you've already answered in written. The first one would be, if you say 85% of Ukrainians would move towards the EU and 15% towards Russia, what would be the reason for the 15% to move to Russia if Ukraine is taken by Russia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But if we look at the course of the war, then we see that one element is a massive destruction of Ukrainian villages and cities in course of the advances. So 12, 13 towns and cities have been completely wiped out. If this is going to continue, then we almost have a policy of torched earth, where large parts of Ukraine, due to the war, simply become unlivable. And I read comments here and there that this is part of the Russian aims of the war, to actually depopulate large swathes of Ukraine. This policy of depopulation we have seen in Transnistria, we have seen it in Chechnya, we have seen it in the occupied parts of Georgia. We have also seen it already in Donbass and Lugansk, even though these oblasts partly came under Russian occupation. Large numbers of the population have left, very often the able-bodied, the younger, and those of working age. And I would assume that the very same pattern would be repeated in case more provinces come under Russian control. So because we have seen it in 2014 and 2022, I would assume the pattern to be repeated.
Thank you. The next question that I see would be, considering your most moderate scenario, what would be the potential impact of a tough winter or the damage of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine?
This is another difficult question, because we have seen during the previous bombing campaign of the critical infrastructure that Ukrainians, even during winter, were very resilient, but also because some elements of the infrastructure, like the heating plants, are rather decentralized, whereas the electricity infrastructure is a lot more centralized. And we see, of course, massive damages and destructions. We saw a massive decline in the output of electricity. We saw an increase in the import of energy from the Western countries. So, so far, we have seen resilience, but I'm not certain for how much longer the population remaining in Ukraine, 31 million people, can endure the hardship, which is not only living in cold apartments, but it's also basically losing jobs, because without electricity, people can't work, factories don't work, cafes can't work, shops can't work. So I have not seen in any of the reports or surveys within Ukraine a hint that the resilience of Ukrainians is decreasing, but this is only for the foreseeable future. So another hard winter might compel more people to leave Ukraine, maybe only temporarily over the winter period, because we see more commuting in spring, for instance. We saw more commuting in summer 2023, for example.
Thank you. And then there are two questions that I will summarize in one. And basically it is Europe ready to accept 20 million citizens of Ukraine? And what are the plans currently when it comes to social, healthcare, economic demands for the documents or other reactions should such influx appear?
Well, I would say in 2022, Europe was not ready, but managed with massive support by the civil society. Otherwise, the reception regime system would have broken down within days or weeks. I've seen that. I have the impression that there is the image that matters up to now are fairly stable, and that matters remain more or less the same. Numbers of Ukrainians in the EU is rather slowly declining, but I have not seen any planning for the kind of worst case scenarios that I've outlined. I'm certain that we would need another response than in 2022, because the total number will keep ever increasing. And we hear from cities and municipalities that are hosting many Ukrainians so far that they have very often reached the limit. So we might need to look into dispersal policies, which were not applied in 2022. We might look into alternative collective housing opportunities, which was not really necessary in 2022 because society/civil society accommodated most of the Ukrainians, 70–75%. So I'm not certain, but I'm not an insider, whether the EU and its member states and the municipalities would be prepared for another large-scale arrival of asylum seekers, but would strongly advise to have some contingency plans in the drawers.
Thank you. Again, two questions that I tried to merge. One would be, how would you assess the relationship of the refugees or displaced Ukrainians and their host societies or the receiving countries, and the composition of those? Because mostly you mentioned it's younger, female, well-educated population that has emigrated. Have you considered in your scenarios a shift in this composition?
I've not considered in my scenarios any shift. That is an option, yes, because so far we have seen also on the side of the host societies a very high level of solidarity, very high levels of resilience for various reasons. We talk about our neighbors in Europe. We talk about women and children. We talk about families, which is sort of causing a humanitarian response, emotional response. I would hope and I would assume that in case of further Russian advances, which comes with all the atrocities and the bombing and the destruction of cities and the persecution of people and sexual violence and all the rest of it, all these nasty incidences, that would trigger another humanitarian response. And I can't see any sign for a tipping point, to be honest. We need to be cautious. One needs to have an eye on that. If there is any tension within society, one would need to respond quickly and manage conflicts within society quickly and well. But I don't see much reason for that to happening.
Thank you. Another question to your opinion, or stimulate this intellectual exercise. Should Russia be progressing? Do you think the interest of Russia would be to push Ukrainians out of the territories, or rather keep them in the territories that they would be occupying?
My impression is that initially Russia was falsely hoping that the majority of Ukrainians would welcome or at least tolerate Russian ruling. And since they realized that Ukrainians in their majority do not want to come under Russian control, ruling, or even boots, instead resisting, they seem to rather apply what they have done, as I've said, in Transnistria, in occupied parts of Georgia, in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, and what you see also in cities like Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, to depopulate to a large extent the occupied territory and push Ukrainians out. Whether or not that makes any sense, no, I don't think so. I mean, I can hardly believe what I say, but my impression is that Russia is pushing or is aiming to push out most Ukrainians, maybe in brackets, also calculating that would further destabilize and thus weaken the European Union, because migration is such a contentious issue.
Thank you. Another question on the positions of various analysts, where some say that the conflict will be frozen this year, some saying that the conflict will be a long one. Question would be, what impact on the duration, so to say, might the elections in the US this year have? What impact would the Russian mobilization have, and the Russian economic recession on the duration of the conflict?
I'm really a migration expert. I'm not a security expert. I'm not an expert on conflict and war. I also notice all these various scenarios. I rather hear currently about an expected Russian offensive, which is already happening in Kharkiv Oblast. We have seen that. We see the amassing of Russian troops in the Belgorod region, who could either move towards Kharkiv, they could also move towards Sumy. I don't see any Russian offensive efforts in the south, in Kherson, Zaporizhia, so moving further west or moving out of Zaporizhia further north. but rather efforts in the east, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkiv, possibly Sumy. And I also see from the news, just like anybody else, that weapons, arms, ammunition has finally arrived on the front line, allowing Ukrainian armed forces to defend more effectively than they had been for the last couple of months. On the outcome of the US elections, I cannot speculate, but there are two scenarios. If the one side wins, the US would continue supporting Ukraine with ammunition, arms, and weapons. In the other case, US support would probably dry out. Whether the EU and allies can compensate for the US stopping to support Ukraine, I don't know, but I have my doubts. And I know too little about the Russian economy to sort of comment really on that. But I see with the appointment of a new defense minister with an economic background, the entire economy is now geared up for the war. And for how long that can be sustained until Russia goes into an economic crisis, which then also affects large parts of the population, increased discontent, is hard to say. I can only say World War I, that was sustainable for 4 years, and then we had revolutions. So it can't be sustained forever in Russia, and that I think we can be certain. But we also don't know how China will respond, whether or not China will sort of maintain support of Russia, or whether in the longer term that will also decline.
Thank you very much. The next question would relate to Ukrainians who migrate to Europe. Whether you could elaborate on the secondary mobility within European continent, maybe with some statistics. And I would dare also to extend this question maybe to should the big amounts of additional refugees be heading towards Europe, the European Union, what would be the absorption capacities? Because there are several main recipients, so to say, within the EU, but can they continue receiving more, or would you see the need for, let's say, distribution to other countries too?
I haven't analyzed secondary migration of Ukrainians ever since 2022. In 2022, it was relatively straightforward and easy, and we understood very well that Ukrainians first entered the neighboring EU countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and from there quickly moved on to other countries, so that we could reconstruct, and people followed what we call in migration studies the migration network effect. So they either went where they already had family, friends, relatives, or contacts, or they went where they had been before when they were labor migrants, like in Portugal, like Spain, Italy, and Greece. But about 30% of this initial dispersal was quite arbitrary, where the buses, where the trains would take them, where NGOs would take them. But the strongest effect is the migration network effect. People go know someone. That would happen again. The next influx of Ukrainians, first and foremost, they would go where they already have their wives and children, family, relatives, and friends. We also know that many more Ukrainians, over 1 million, applied for Canadian visa, but only about 220,000 by the moment went to Canada. So many Ukrainians do still have a valid Canadian entry visa, but didn't go. So there is this this aspiration or this option, this emergency exit towards Canada. Whether that's going to be continued, I don't know. Would be interesting to look at Canadian policy, whether the visa is still, whether people can still apply to the visa. And in terms of the absorption capacity, I know the case of Germany bad. Colleagues of mine at another university recently conducted a survey asking municipalities for their absorption capacity. 40% of the municipalities said that they have no more capacity to any more refugees of any kind, so including Ukrainians, but 60% said they still have absorption capacities. So the matter is to handle and manage the influx well, so that new displaced persons would be directed to the municipalities that still have absorption capacity. The same principle would apply to all other member states, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. I have seen very similar statistics from Slovakia suggesting that the western, from Czech Republic suggesting that the western part of the of Czech Republic is saturated, whereas there still is absorption capacity in the eastern part. And of course, 60% of all Ukrainians went to only 3 EU member states, Poland, Germany, and Czech Republic. So if there would be any more displaced persons from Ukraine, I do see a need to better disperse them across the European Union, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, other countries. I think that the Baltic countries also took in a fairly large share and are probably also saturated.
Thank you. I'm looking at the chat. There might be a question that relates to what you've just presented. On EU level, the instruments, there is the Temporary Protection Directive, there is the new Pact on Asylum and Migration. Do you see a possibility that these could be somehow synchronized in the future, or whether on EU level there will be another legal framework adopted to address Ukrainians? Dot.
Well, I suspect you know better because you are nearer at the European Union policy processes, but from the hints I got, there is rather considered to extend the Temporary Protection Directive by, I don't know how many more years, 1 year, 2 years. I don't see an appetite for moving Ukrainians into any other international protection scheme like asylum, because this is exactly what the EU and the member states wanted to avoid, that 1 million people apply individually to the authorities, go through the process that would immediately overburden the authorities. So I'm not certain we are going to see that. And maybe you want to respond to that question from your side. How do you understand the discussion within the EU on the future of the temporary protection? I think it is urgent. It's 10 months and the protection status expired. It's over 4 million people who are sort of living with this major uncertainty. And I don't think anybody in the EU would want to risk that we have 4 million people in the Union without a proper migration status. So that I'm sure we can't have. So, but finding a solution seems pretty urgent.
Thank you also for the invitation to react from my side. I think I will not go into details, but will mention that for ICMPD, this has been of the topics that we have been paying attention to since at least a year, bringing to the attention of the EU institutions and member states that the Temporary Protection Directive is about to end in March 2025, and that there is a need to address it. There have been joint seminars, meetings with IGC and ICMPD, and there are several publications. These two I can recommend that one can find on the ICMPD website, elaborating on the subject and considering various scenarios and approaches. Having a look at the chat, there is a question that relates to my view to energy sector, but I will still bring it up for you to react, and it's about the damaged power plants, whether Ukrainians focus on repairing the damaged ones or build several smaller ones instead.
Well, that's a question for an engineer. It's not a question for a migration expert. I understand that repairs are underway, that replacement is underway in terms of generators, and that alternative sources of energy, sustainable energy, are considered and partly introduced. And also that the current system, which is based on very large centralized power plants, is going to be more decentralized. I'm not an engineer, but I cannot imagine that that can be done in a matter of months. It rather takes years, I suppose, both to repair the damaged or destroyed power plants, as well as to set up completely new ones and decentralize the system. So I'm not sure this is any short-term solution, I'm afraid. At the moment, Ukraine seems to more strongly rely on energy imports, and I'm glad that the networks in the Ukraine and EU have been synchronized, and this has become an option.
Thank you. From energy sector to military, maybe. Do you think that one of solutions to mass refugees could be a safe zone in Western Ukraine protected by the NATO?
I would first wonder, why would one only want to protect a safe zone in the West and not the whole of Ukraine? So why would that not have been considered in 2021-22? And there was a theoretical option to do that. Protecting only a rump state, Western Ukraine, full of IDPs, I find it very hard to imagine. Also looking at the structure of Ukraine, with most of the large cities, with most of the industries and the large rivers in the east, moving millions of people from the east to the west, which is traditionally poorer, less industrialized, less densely populated. I find very hard to consider and to digest, to be honest. In theory, there are these thoughts, yes, a safe zone, like in northern Syria. We have seen it in other cases. I'm not sure it's very realistic. I'm not sure it works very well. And also, that would imply, and I wonder whether the EU, the member states, would want that to contain people in that zone so that they are not going to leave the zone. Is that something that we would want? I cannot answer that, but sort of one comes with the other. And protecting parts of Ukraine by NATO, Western forces, another alliance of countries, is a very tempting idea. Governments will have to decide on that, but so far the answer has always been no.
Thank you. Another question that I hope I understand well. It is whether you would foresee the possibility of safe shelter, and I translate for myself, within Ukraine, recognized identity, economic opportunity, etc., in a hypothetical condition that Russia overpowers Ukraine, and Ukrainians decide not to migrate outside of Ukraine?
Well, it's certainly possible, and this is what the current situation tells us, that a certain proportion of Ukrainians would remain in Ukraine, living on Russia-occupied territory. We've seen it in Lugansk, Donetsk, and that is what I've shown, where we see that 40–50% of the people have roughly left and the other half have stayed. We don't know, we don't have very good data on the characteristics of the people who stayed and who left. But the trend seems to be that the able-bodied younger people of working age are rather leaving territory coming under Russian control or occupation, and that it's rather the older people who are leaving. And the older people are possibly less threatened by Russian atrocities, the type of atrocities that we have seen in the occupied parts, and the Russian persecution. Whether or not it is safe enough, I have my doubts, to be honest. I mean, from the reports that we receive from Kherson, from other occupied villages, it seems to me that Russian military and occupying forces are fairly violent, fairly brutal, fairly ruthless. And whether we can talk of any safe shelters, I would have my doubts, to be honest.
Close to this question might be the next one, which also relates to internally displaced people from eastern Ukraine who move into western Ukraine, like Lviv. What would be the social, economic, and infrastructure dynamics of these regions, and whether potentially this could lead into dividing Ukraine into two parts, and how to prevent or deal with this phenomenon?
Well, as I've suggested, so far, eastern Ukraine has been more densely populated with all the large cities, with the heavy industries, with a lot of the infrastructure. I look at Dnipro as a financial capital. So Lviv, where I have family, is a cultural capital, is a very different case. So we have already an uneven Ukraine with higher GDPs in the east than in the west. The west is probably now already catching up. So I would rather assume maybe some equalizing effect, which might be not that bad news for Ukraine, to also have a more balanced distribution of population across the country, which comes with a better balance of GDP. I mean, oblast like Ivano-Frankivsk, beautiful it is. It's one of the poorest oblasts in Ukraine, as far as I remember. So it is to the benefits, to some extent, of the western parts of Ukraine, which might be catching up. And I don't really see if there's a balancing of an already unequal situation that it would lead to a split of the country. Maybe not. Maybe there could be even opportunities in that.
Thank you. I see two questions that return or revert to what has already been brought up. One would be the role of the new EU pact on a future massive wave of Ukrainian refugees. The pact will come into force in 2 years, and especially Central and Eastern bordering Ukraine might face the limitations to the absorption capacities to accept new amount of foreigners. I think this has been addressed earlier. There's another question that relates also to the expiry, so to say, of the Temporary Protection Directive. Do you think this would lead to another flow, as it appears that the treatment of Ukrainian beneficiaries are now being modified in various EU states in anticipation of migration flows? I think it has been addressed earlier, but if you would like to elaborate further on this, please go ahead.
To the first question, very briefly, these are two very different migration policies. The directive on temporary protection is applied to a very specific case, and the EU Migration Pact applies to another different case of a mixed flow of asylum seekers and irregular immigrants. So two different cases, and we should not mix them, and we should also understand that both these policies and laws, EU laws, are different laws for different cases and raise different challenges. The second question, yes, it's a good one. We have, as I've said, two types of inflows or arrivals: Ukrainians seeking temporary protection, and other migrants either seeking international protection or, in brackets, if we look at the statistics, rather employment opportunities. And there might come a point, and some member states already clearly say that they have reached certain limits. Municipalities also say they have reached certain limits where they can't accept or take on more. I would critically investigate whether that's a claim or whether there's really a case, whether this is substantiated or whether this is rather an issue of maybe managing such an influx better. Despite the many crises we face in the world, I'm not at the moment seeing any unprecedented, unexpected, large-scale influx from any other part of the world. The Gaza conflict is very contained. The numbers of Palestinians are not increasing in any alarming figures. Sudanese displacement is massive, but there is no tradition of Sudanese migration to Europe. Some labor migration to Italy maybe, but not massive numbers. So I'm not yet seeing that in the near future that would affect Europe. I'm not doing scenarios on these other cases. I've done that in the past, but at the moment, I'm not very pessimistic. So I hope that answers another very difficult but also partly hypothetical question.
Thank you very much. Well, our webinar is coming to its end, so I would take last question, if I may, and it's not an easy one, which is: what is the potential role of EU member states or EU in bringing back Ukrainian men of military age?
Well, yes, that's a difficult question because it has so many different dimensions. It applies, in fact, to the whole question of a return. There is the interest of the Ukrainian side to bring men of fighting age back, sooner or later, to bring as many Ukrainians back as possible, to rebuild the country. There are the interest, to some extent, of the host countries with their labor-hungry industries, with their aging populations, who are therefore accepting and maybe more willing to continue to host significant numbers of Ukrainians. And there are, of course, the Ukrainians themselves who make their own choices about their lives. Any compulsory return will cause problems. If you just think it through, how would one compel Ukrainian men of conscription age who are currently in the EU to return? One would need to cancel their protection status, which would probably be a violation of EU law, because there is a reason for seeking protection. And if you deny this to men, it will be difficult to justify. Then one would need to compel them returning. Would they want to go voluntarily, under pressure? Maybe some, many, maybe not, because they are with their wives and children, they do the language courses, maybe they are working. So how do you compel them? Then we need to talk about removal, deportation, rates. I cannot imagine, certainly not in Germany, that the authorities would consider raiding Ukrainian households in search of these men, even if they don't have an immigration status. So at the end of the day, I don't see much scope for compulsory return. It's rather a matter of convincing individuals, I suppose, and that would be the job of the Ukrainian authorities, embassies, but not so much the EU authorities, I suppose. So it's a very vague answer to a very vague question. And it would involve a very sort of cautious balance of the various interests, thinking through the implications and considering what would be realistically possible and humane and reconcilable with the liberal environment that we live in the EU. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this answer. Thank you. I think we are coming to an end of our webinar, so thank you for your presentation, for your answers, also for the policy brief. I invite all participants to have a look at it, read it. I also thank all participants who stayed with us till the end and who actively asked questions. I hope that the discussions fostered here today will inspire a continued dialogue and lead to effective solutions. I would like to invite everyone to follow the Prague Process website, where this policy brief and other products of the work of the Migration Observatory and Training Academy are available, where you will also see announcements of our upcoming events. And last, I would like to say this year, the Prague Process celebrates its 50th anniversary, which is an important milestone for our participating states. And I believe we will continue in productive discussions and joint work in coming decades or more. Before we say goodbye, I would like to invite all participants to stay a bit longer and wait for the poll that will help us to design future webinars and future events in online regime to even more satisfaction of participants. Thank you once again. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a good day.
It was my pleasure. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Yeah.